Good afternoon. I'm Sara Wyant, the founder and editor of Agri-Pulse. And I'm really pleased to see such interest in our topic today. What will the midterm elections mean for you and for farm policy? The good news is that we are here today to provide a very early look at that question. The bad news is that not all of the election results are in, and we still don't know the final outcomes for control of the House and the Senate. But our talented team at Agri-Pulse was up most of the night and throughout early morning hours to bring you the very latest, and will continue to do so on our website, agri-pulse.com. And in the only shameless plug I'm going to make throughout today's webinar, if you're not already a subscriber, please go to that site and sign up for a month-long free trial. We do know a few things that we need to keep in mind as we have these discussions. Historically, the party in power almost always loses seats in either the House of Representatives or the Senate, and sometimes both during these midterm elections. The trend is usually amplified when the president's approval rating is under 50%. President Joe Biden is around 41% compared to 53% who disapprove. Considering these historical trends, and you add in things like high inflation, relatively high fuel prices, concerns about crime, Republicans were expecting a big night last night. But other factors were also at play. Many Democrats were confident that they could buck historical trends. They pointed to other factors such as candidate quality and those who were in denial mode still left over from the 2022 presidential election. Abortion initiatives were on ballots in 5 states and generated a lot of Democratic enthusiasm in many other states. So what we've seen thus far is that a red wave didn't materialize, or perhaps it's simply a red ripple. Democrats exceeded expectations in many parts of the country. For example, in Pennsylvania, Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman defeated Republican challenger Mehmet Oz to flip the U.S. Senate seat in Pennsylvania. We're still waiting on the outcomes of races in Arizona and Nevada, and we'll be waiting until at least December 6th for a runoff election between Senator Ralph Warnock, who sits on the Senate Agriculture Committee, and his GOP challenger, Herschel Walker. So this afternoon, we're going to hear key insights about what we do know thus far from our distinguished speakers, and then open up the discussion for facilitated questions and answers from you, the audience. Feel free to offer your questions in the Q&A portion of the bottom of the screen, not the chat box. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, feel free to use the Q&A function. Let us know, and our team will be there to assist you. We have a Zoom representative on hand. In addition, we're going to be recording today's session, and the webinar will be available later today at later today or early tomorrow at agripulse.com. To start, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's joining me on screen, Michael Torrey. A longtime friend, he's the founder and principal of the Torrey Advisory Group, a bipartisan consulting firm that specializes in advocacy, association management, coalition building, government relations, and thought leadership around food and agricultural issues. Torrey has more than 30 years of experience in legislative and regulatory policy development, having served with Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole and Senators Nancy Landon Kassebaum and Sheila Fromm. Torrey has also held numerous roles in executive branch, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations and Deputy Chief of Staff at USDA, also Special Assistant at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He's been an advisor for numerous presidential campaigns and presidential transition teams. And he's also a Kansas State University alumni. Please welcome Mike Torrey.
All right, Sara, thank you for that kind introduction. You know, I think I share the view that a lot of you may share, that I'm kind of getting tired of surprises, right? It seems like every time we move into an election, there's something that we didn't expect. But before I get into that, I do want to give a shout out, Sara, to you. And I think I speak for a lot of folks that are watching this today. on how much we appreciate your publication. I think the words that you use on your website are balanced reporting and trusted insights. And certainly if there was ever a time for a need for such thing, it's been the last few years. So thank you for all that you do. And it's very much appreciated. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to kind of lay the groundwork. For any of you, I think you're probably sympathetic to me for, coming online so soon after the election to try to talk about what happened. And that certainly is why we have a chat function. So please provide your feedback as we walk through this. Going back to the surprise, I just have to say a word real quick about polls, because the postmortem on this is going to spend a lot of time about whether the polls were right or wrong. You think back to 2016 when the pollsters did not identify the Trump voters. You think back to the last election when the polls showed that the Democrats were going to possibly have a filibuster-proof Senate and that they were going to have a wave in the House. And then it turned out to actually be the opposite of that, with a 50-50 Senate and a smaller margin in the House. And now we watch the same media talk about how we were going to have a wave for Republicans. And certainly that didn't happen. And I only offer that because the one thing that's remained true is that the margin of error on those polls doesn't change much. It's not talked about much, but it doesn't change much. And I'm finally at a point, I think, that as we go into this next election, whatever the polls say or whatever the media says, maybe take just the opposite view of that, right? So moving into just a couple of things here that I wanted to throw out. The bottom line, obviously, I think we're going to go through is not a lot changed. I mean, whether the House is Republican or not, whether the Senate is Republican or not, the margins are small. And that's going to have an impact on what's going to get done. And I think we'll get into that in the Q&A. I would also offer up that a lot of the focus as we think about what's going to happen next year, I know it's on the Farm Bill, but at the very same time, if ever there was challenges in the food and ag sector that were probably some of the biggest challenges that all of us have seen in our professional lifetime, I mean, it's now. Inflation certainly is the undercurrent, but at the same time, costs are increasing to do business. Just throw out transportation, and whether you say river, rail, truck, or ocean, I mean, everybody is feeling the impact of this. Labor shortages are having an impact on the supply chain, nutrition and health issues, and then, of course, production risk, whether it's weather-related events or geopolitical events like what's happened in the Ukraine. And these are not issues that are dealt with in the Ag Committee. These are issues that are dealt with in the Congress and a lot of what government does. And so I think I can speak for all of us that as we think about what's going to happen this next year, it's going to be important, and hopefully it'll happen, that folks are going to find a way to come together on some of these issues that we are all facing so we can address that. But today we're going to focus on what can be done in Congress and what the possibilities are for that. And speaking of Congress, this election, assuming there's going to be a change in the House or the Senate, this will be the fifth election in a row where there's been a change in the majority of the House or Senate or the White House. And to put some data points around that, if you think back since the 2018 Farm Bill, all right, since then in the House of Representatives, out of 435 members, 150 are new. That's not taking into account yesterday's election. On the House Ag Committee, of the 50 members, 27 are new. Again, not taking into account what has happened. And likewise in the Senate, out of 100 senators, 15 are new. And on the committee itself, 7 are new. So we're going to see not only that change, but more change that we'll probably get into during this conversation. And for all of us, that means that a lot of time is going to be spent on blocking and tackling and bringing a lot of new faces up to speed. And you know how when folks come to town and they always have new ideas that have been around for a while. And there's no doubt in my mind that in the next 24 months, we're going to be dealing with a lot of those as well. So with that, I'm going to pause and look forward to the questions and the answers. Thank you, Sara.
Well, thank you, Mike. Great way to start us out with some perspective. And next, we're going to invite Senator Heidi Heitkamp to join us on the screen. She's no stranger to many of you, representing North Dakota from 2013 to 2019, the first woman elected to represent the state as U.S. Senator. Heitkamp served on the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, the Committee on Ag, Nutrition, and Forestry, as well as the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. After leaving the Senate, she's been pretty busy. She helped found the One Country Project, an organization focused on addressing the needs and concerns of rural communities. She currently serves as Director of Agriculture at the tax consultancy group, Wyant Group, and is on the boards of the McCain Institute, the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, the Renew Democracy Initiative, and the German Marshall Fund. She is also an on-air contributor on politics and public affairs for ABC News and CNBC. And I know she had a busy night trying to keep track of all of the political commentary going on. And on top of that, she was recently named director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics that shall start January 3rd of next year. So welcome, Senator Heitkamp.
Well, it kind of makes me sound like I can't figure out what I'm doing with my life. But agriculture is always at the center of what I think about and how I think about the American economy. You know, what we are is what we produce. And I like to tell my friends who don't think that they should be concerned about agriculture that basically new wealth is created from our intellectual ability, but also from what we can produce from this earth or extract from this earth. And agriculture is probably the single most important basic industry that we have that creates wealth. And so this is something that affects everyone. I want to start out not by taking issue with some of what Mike said, but I want to talk about the polling. You know, everybody wants a perfect world. Everybody wants, you know, please tell me what's going to happen. And so that I don't even have to count the votes. All of these polls were within the margin of error. What we're seeing right now is really what I would say is a trend back from the August polls that didn't get reported because there wasn't a lot of polling in August. The Democrats were losing momentum coming out of the Dodd decision, which really segregated and moved the Democrats into a very optimistic position. As the economy became more significant, you saw those polls narrow. But I think before you criticize the polling, I think you need to understand the basic problem that we have, which is everybody wants certainty in their predictions. If we had that, we wouldn't need to count the votes. And so here we are looking at what people anticipated was going to be a red wave. I never thought it was going to be a red wave, and I will tell you why. The 2020 election, when we went into that election, Nancy Pelosi predicted not only would she hold her majority, but that she would pick up anywhere from 10 to 15 seats. We actually lost about 13 to 20 seats, depending on how you count it, in 2020. And so a lot of the low-hanging fruit that you typically would see transition in a midterm was already gone in the 2020 election, leaving the Democrats with a much narrower margin. This is the situation that Ryan is going to, or not Ryan, but Kevin McCarthy is going to be in, or Scalise, whoever eventually becomes Speaker of the House. They are going to have to navigate a very narrow, I think, majority. I don't think it's likely that there won't be a majority, but I think instead of the prediction last night coming out of the election that it would be a 15-vote majority, I think it's going to be much narrower than that. And so it's going to take the level of skill that you saw the Speaker Pelosi extract when she pulled her caucus together to bring the Republican caucus together. For agriculture, the good news in all of this is that agriculture isn't frequently one of those hot button topics, you know, whether it is taking a look at taxation, whether it's looking at the debt ceiling. You know, we basically have built a system with leadership like Colin Peterson, with leadership like Debbie Stabenow and John Bozeman and all the previous Ag Committee leaders that really begins to look at how we can work together. The challenge that we always have in a farm bill is balancing that urban concern about food security with the farm concern about making sure that we are producing enough food, not only for this country, but for the world. And it's never been more important than it is right now that we look at our ability to provide global exports as we look at the challenges that both Russia and Ukraine are presenting, the potential for some global famine, given weather patterns, especially in Africa. And so we've got a big job ahead of us. And our job in agriculture is to convince people that this isn't just about guaranteeing that we can feed our country, but it's also a national security imperative to feed the world, as we do not want to destabilize government in other sectors and other parts of the country. And so I also want to say, I don't know about the rest of you all, but in North Dakota, we've had a pretty good farm year. If you got a crop, you made some money. And you also have had the ability to maybe put some of that money back into inputs before the end of the year. Now, that's not to say we aren't challenged by fertilizer costs. We aren't challenged by some of the transportation costs that Michael just talked about, some of the transportation bottlenecks. Obviously, very concerned about a rail strike, been watching that very closely. But I think, again, not to toot the horn for Joe Biden, but negotiating a stop on a potential rail strike was one of the things that he did for American agriculture that I think is getting undervalued right now. And so what we need to remind ourselves is that when we go into hyper-partisan mode in agriculture, all of agriculture loses, because we have detractors on the right, and we have detractors on the left, and the rest of us in the middle understand the importance of agriculture. And so I expect that whether it's John Bozeman, who's a great guy, I worked with him on basically getting credit to Cuban buyers so that we could actually exploit and address that market. He understands agriculture. I don't grow a lot of rice in North Dakota. We don't grow a lot of rice in North Dakota, but he is a staunch defender of his industry. Debbie Stabenow is someone who knows how to work across the aisle and get farm bills done. And I expect that no matter what happens over in the House, we're going to see a real interest in getting a farm bill, at least begin to address it. What can stop us are things that in the long run don't matter. They are things like whether we are going to do debt forgiveness for historically disadvantaged minority farmers, whether we're going to nitpick the food security programs, whether we're going to listen to people on the left say, look, we can't be doing any kind of farm subsidy unless there's climate smart agriculture applied. And all of those are wrong-headed. Because in the middle, we can compromise. Just as a final point, I would say Saxby Chambliss and I chaired the Bipartisan Policy Center's initiative on agriculture and climate smart practices. A lot of what we had recommended in our final report was adopted in the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going through a series of pilot projects that have been authorized by the Department of Agriculture. I think those could be very successful. A lot of those have been very bipartisan in terms of the states that those initiatives have affected. And so, those of you who say, well, if the House and Senate go Republican, there won't be any climate-based agricultural initiatives in the Farm Bill, I think that's wrong-sided. It puts us on an up and down cycle depending upon who gets elected, whether the Democrats have control or the Republicans have control. And so the name of the game in being successful for American farmers and producers is working together, is putting our ideology and our partisanship aside and making sure that we are growing food for this country, but that we are also in the position to export to maintain the viability of democracies globally and the security of other countries that, if destabilized, will cost us more in the long run. So I'm going to leave it at that and just say, probably in no other area would I say this as clearly. The results of the election will not affect, in my opinion, what happens in the farm program and what issues are considered before both the House and the Senate Ag committees.
Well, thank you, Senator Heitkamp. I appreciate that perspective, and you always do such a great job recapping from your experiences on the committee as well as your current political roles. Next up, we have Phil Brasher, who's the executive editor for our team at Agri-Pulse. Phil has been leading our election coverage, and he's got a long history reporting on food and agriculture dating back to his early entrance to Washington, D.C. in 1999. He leverages his deep knowledge of the issues and his experience with not only us, but his network of extensive sources across Capitol Hill, where we try to provide you every day with the best coverage on farm, food, and rural issues. So please welcome Phil to give you some of the highlights of what we've provided so far with our coverage.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Mike and Heidi for the lead in and your remarks. I just want to kind of update and provide some context to the rest of our discussion and get us back quickly to your questions for Mike and Heidi. Sarah talked about the Senate. The only thing I would add is that it's important to remember that the Republicans have lost a seat in Pennsylvania. So just to stay even at 50 seats, which would leave the Democrats in control, they need to flip either Arizona or Nevada. The best chance appears to be in Nevada, where Adam Laxalt is in the lead. If they can flip that seat, then it comes down to Georgia, the likely runoff December 6th. Then the question is, will the Republicans really get out for Herschel Walker? Will the Democrats come back to the polls for Raphael Warnock and the independents and all those voters who went for Brian Kemp in the governor's race, but then voted for Warnock in the Senate race. I want to switch to the House. I have a map here that I'd like to just talk about a little bit about the situation in the House. Right now, where things sit, the Republicans have won 204 seats. They need 218 seats to win control. They're now at 214. That's according to the Associated Press, which calls races when there's no chance of the outcome going the other way. For now, they have them sitting at 204 seats. Republicans still win control. They're probably more likely than not to win control, but it's going to be a small majority, and the Democrats technically still have a shot, a long shot at keeping control. Sarah talked about the fact that we didn't see the wave that many folks thought we would see. One of the reasons was the members of the House Agriculture Committee. It's important to remember about half of the House Ag members were targeted by Republicans. And the reason it's rather logical because a number of the Democrats on the committee have substantial rural portions to their districts, which means they have a number of Republican voters. On the other hand, a lot of these districts are fairly mixed. They're a mixture of suburban voters and rural voters. We saw that as the case in Virginia. See that district in dark blue. Abigail Spanberger's whose district goes into the Washington, D.C. suburbs. She held on. Same is true as Angie Craig up in Minnesota in the Twin Cities suburb, Sharice Davids outside of Kansas City. And Cindy Axney, that race has not been called yet. That's the district in yellow, which takes in the Des Moines, Metro Des Moines area and a bit of southern Iowa. That race is still undecided. Those just highlight a couple. Come back to this band. A couple of those are important, I think, for farm policy, and probably one of the reasons that Heidi is right that the election may not have that much impact. Spanberger could be very important because she's chairs the conservation subcommittee, and she's also been a leading advocate of climate-smart farming practices. She's a lead sponsor of the Growing Climate Solutions Act. Angie Craig up in Minnesota has been a fairly vocal advocate for ethanol biofuels, certainly with this administration. Just to go over the races that we're still watching, several the ones that are still undecided that involve House Ag Committee members. That's Johanna Hayes up in Connecticut, up in Western Connecticut, right next door to another House Ag Committee member who went down, Sean Patrick Maloney, in southern New York, just above New York City. Moving over, we mentioned Sydney Axney's race in 3rd District of Iowa. Now the Secretary of State's office there says all the vote is in. Zach Nunn, the Republican, is leading by about 2,000 votes, but that race has not been officially called yet. So we're leaving that in the undecided. Same with Tom O'Halloran in Arizona. He was a victim of redistricting, was widely expected to lose this race and is trailing significantly. CNN has projected him to lose it. Then the other one I would highlight up in Washington, Kim Schreier, member of the House Ag Committee. She is also leading, but her race has not been called yet as well. Also, moving down to California, as we know, takes a lot of time to count its votes these days. Several critical races there. A couple of the Democrats on the House Ag Committee leading, expected to win re-election, but the races have not been called yet. That's Jim Costa in the Central Valley, and then moving up, Josh Harder in the 9th District in California. Another district we're watching is 22nd District. That's David Valadao. He's not on the House Ag Committee. He's on the House Ag Appropriations Subcommittee. He lost in 2018, came back and won a seat back in 2020. He's been leading, but it's, as we said, in California, it's still quite early. And just to wrap up and mention where we did have some losses, Sean Patrick Maloney in New York, head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, but also had a difficult situation because of redistricting. Same with Al Lawson down in Florida. Republicans basically gutted his district. He ran in another district and lost. So he will be moving off the House Ag Committee. One other race worth mentioning again is Illinois 17. It's a long, slender district. Sherry Bustos district. She's retiring. Democrat is leading, but we have not, that race has not been called yet as well. But at this point is trending toward the Democratic candidate. So there we are. Basically, the story is House Ag Committees were heavily targeted by Republicans. Millions of dollars are spent on some of these races, especially in Abigail Spanberger's race in Virginia. But somewhat, it's also been a critical part of the Democratic firewall this time around. Very mixed results for Republicans. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Phil. And, you know, we knew that this was a possibility, and we had an earlier map of which we were trying to decide when Iowa would call Congressman Axney's race, but just in the middle of your remarks, the Associated Press called it in favor of Zach Nunn. So we can color that one back in on the red column. So many of these are just, you know, moving parts today as we look at races, like you mentioned, the 17th in Illinois. And we've tried really hard not to get out in front of our skis on any of these things. But we could probably have another one called by the time we're done here in this hour. So what I'd like to do now is I have one question for Phil, and I'd like to bring all of our panelists back on. and have our discussion. And I know that some questions are starting to come into the Q&A. That's great. We'll get to some of those, but Phil, just as someone who has been in both in covering North Dakota, Phil's a Texas native, but he worked in North Dakota, he worked in my home state of Iowa. You know, when we started our careers, so many of these agricultural districts were Democratic districts, and you know, now at least especially in the Midwest, not so much on the coast, but they become redder and redder. How difficult does that make it for the farm vote to really advance some of their interests when it's more one party in some states? From what, you know, the days when we had Colin Peterson and, you know, Senator Heitkamp remembers that how blue North Dakota was. You know, we had some really great leadership on behalf of both parties, but now it's trended in farm country to more conservative in many areas.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I could, as you mentioned, the Dakotas, I can remember when that was mostly blue. You had entire Montana as well. I think the big difference I remember is you had Democrats who were as tied in with major farm groups, corn growers, and crop insurance, and well versed in those issues. Now the Democratic membership of the House Ag Committee tends to be more urban. Now there's certainly exceptions to that, and a number of Angie Craig I mentioned, Abigail Spanberger, Jim Costa, a number of these. There are some members on the Democratic side of House Ag Committee that still have substantial production ag in their districts, but there are also a number of members of Democrats on that committee are primarily interested in nutrition programs that come from pretty urban districts. So that's been a significant change.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Sarah, if I can just add something, I think you can track kind of the movement in rural America away from the Democratic Party pretty exactly by the movement of the Republican Party towards supporting a robust farm program. The last time you saw kind of blue urban or rural areas was when George Bush vetoed the Farm Bill twice, saying it was too much money. And you know, after people like Pat Roberts began to really take the lead on crop insurance, take the lead on navigating the Republican caucuses towards a farm policy that worked for farmers, that economic argument equalized. And I think then in rural America, the cultural arguments moved in. And so, you know, let's not forget that the Democratic Party historically has been the party that supported a pretty robust farm program. The Republican Party has come to the same kind of thinking, kind of moving forward. Probably the biggest division that you're going to see, if it's not in sugar, it is in ethanol. And I think Phil raised that issue about ethanol and the critical kind of coalitions that have to be built across party line. This was probably my one and only big fight with somebody like James Langford, who hated and still hates the ethanol program. So these are not partisan debates. They tend to be regional. They tend to be based on, you know, Oklahoma, big energy producing state. So is North Dakota, but their delegation tends to side with the farmers.
And Heidi, it matters when an administration has members of its own party that it needs to protect on a policy like ethanol, right?
Absolutely. And you know, when you look at that, and that's really, Phil, why we created One Country. Not only is it bad for the Democratic Party not to do well in rural America, it's bad for rural America to be one party America, because it really creates vulnerability. And I'm not pitching, you know, any kind of partisan agenda here. I'm just saying that when you become reliably one side or the other, you get taken for granted, and eventually it'll come home to roost.
Could you elaborate just a little bit more on that in terms of what you're talking about in terms of the cultural divide? We had Congressman Colin Peterson on our newsmakers programs last week, and the former congressman was very adamant about the fact that the Democratic Party of today is the Democratic Party that he grew up in, and that, you know, Hubert Humphrey would not recognize it. I mean, he was pretty adamant about the changes. I know you've tried to do a lot of messaging and outreach in rural areas, but is the cultural divide now a bridge too far?
You know, I think one of the divisive issues over many years has been the issue of reproductive rights. Kansas kind of proved that that's not really an urban-rural issue, right? Where Kansas voted overwhelmingly in rural area, in urban areas to support a woman's right to choose. They also voted a majority in rural areas. I think that it really comes down to identifying what the expectations are of the parties, and you know, I have this line that I use, which is, look, you know, what a farmer in Carrington, North Dakota wants for his family is really no different than what a cab driver in New York City wants for his family or her family. And why is it that we're so divided then on what our expectations are of government? Because we as politicians exploit fear, and we exploit division, and whether it's immigration, which quite frankly, having a robust and good immigration policy that's fair to everyone is good for American agriculture, especially for people who grow fruits and vegetables in California and across the country. But yet we can't seem to get there because the cultural wars step in. And so I just think that it's incumbent that when we're trying to deal with rural policies, because there's fewer and fewer of us. I think at one point the line I use is less than 15, only about 15 to 20% of all House members actually have a farmer in their district. And so we have to broaden our appeal. We have to talk about how this is a national security issue, this is a food security issue, and this is a base industry that builds our economy. And when we can make everybody invested in agriculture, whether they live in Carrington or they live in New York City, agriculture is going to do well on public policy. But if we interject fear and culture-based arguments, we lose the ability to build those coalitions.
So turning just to some of our questions that are coming in, one is from Greg, and he wants to know about, and Mike, I'd like you to take a stab at this one first, whether or not you expect any material changes in the Farm Bill pre versus post election. And again, granted, we don't know the final outcome, so maybe we can game out Democratic control, what changes might happen as a result of election going their way versus Republican control, what changes you might expect as a result of either party staying in power or flipping.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and thank you, Sarah. And I'll do my best here to try to address that. I think that the margins being as close as they are in the House and Senate is going to make it difficult to have some sort of a revolutionary farm bill, if you will, or something that's going to have significant change. And certainly one of the things to kind of pay attention to, at least as far as the House of Representatives go, is are they going to try to pass a farm bill with Republican only votes, which they've done during the last couple of farm bills, or are they going to try to reach across the aisle and pass a farm bill? And I would tend to believe that their starting point is going to try to be to pass a Republican only farm bill. And if you go back and look at the 14 farm bill and you look at the 18 farm bill, and how many Republican votes they lost, they were all greater than what maybe is going to be the 10 vote margin of the House. They were anywhere from 12 to 60 votes. So the question becomes, what kind of farm bill are the Republicans going to need to get out of the House? And that would kind of stand in contrast to, will it be kind of the same or will it be different? And if that is the path they choose, then we could see a bill coming out of the House that could be significantly different, just trying to get the votes as a way to get to conference. As far as the Senate goes, you know, if you think about the votes that they've had to get that farm bill out in the past, was it Democrat votes or Republican votes? Well, it was a lot of Democrat votes in the last farm bill that moved it. So my sense is in the Senate, there's going to be a bill that the chair and ranking member, no matter who they are going to find a way to work together to get something that they can pass and get to conference with as well. Coming into this farm bill, the big issue was on funding, and I think we've heard a lot of saber rattling about going after some of the hunger programs because of the significant funding increases in the past years. But I think with a margin this small for House Republicans, it's going to be difficult to get much reform, if I had to guess. But I would certainly defer to the senator from North Dakota in terms of her experience in the farm bill and look forward to what she's thinking.
Senator Heitkamp?
At the end of the day, you can't pass a farm bill unless you get a compromise on nutrition, whether it's SNAP, whether it's school nutrition. There's going to be a big push for free hot lunch. And so there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of opportunity to find out how climate smart agriculture can actually provide economic benefits to farmers. I testified actually before the House Ag Committee, the full House Ag Committee, which was kind of a painful experience, I have to say. I have not spent a lot of time over in the House and certainly haven't testified before the full House Committee, but I was on the Zoom for 5 hours answering questions, which is a whole new experience for me. But clearly, a big division on what we need to do on climate. So does that mean we can't get a farm bill that I think achieves some compromise? You see the Farm Bill the Farm Bureau stepping up with great ideas. And so, my advice always to groups, whether it's the corn growers, which I recently spoke at the Corn Congress, is, just try and put your ideology and your partisanship aside and think about where compromise can really provide opportunity for you to get the systems that you need, whether it is greater export supports, whether it is taking a look at greater research as we look at new challenges that were experienced as a result of, if you want to call it weather or climate. I'm a big believer that the land grant colleges need an influx of resources. And I will tell you right now, my big concern are things that don't reach the level, which is land ownership, more and more Chinese ownership of farmland. What do we know about that? Only 25% of the farmland in North Dakota is actually farmed by a producer, by somebody who owns it. Think about that. That's North Dakota, where we don't allow corporate farming. And also what we need to do to build workforce and have a younger group of farmers. These are all kind of what I call look up issues. It's not, what are we going to do on crop insurance? What are we going to do on, the EQIP program, and how are we going to fund that? Look up and realize that we have consolidation and some real challenges in agriculture. How do we make those win-wins for all of us?
And if I may, Sarah, I would offer an additional thought in that if there is a change in chairs, and if there is a Republican chair in one or both bodies, there will be, in my view, oversight hearings. There's been a lot of spending in the last 4 years, 6 years on programs, including in the climate arena. So I suspect that that's going to enter into the conversation. And at the end of the day, President Biden has to sign whatever bill comes out. And I think it's probably in their best interest as well that they would prefer to get a bill done sooner than later. Now, we can talk into the reality of that happening in this environment, but I would say that if we don't have a farm bill, in place a year from now, then we're probably going to be looking at a little bit of a delay for a couple of years. And the challenges that the senator and I both talked about certainly would suggest that agriculture is looking for stability. So I think everybody's hope is that they're able to take this up this year and find a way forward.
So Mike, just reading between the tea leaves a little bit, since you mentioned the 2013 bill became 14 bill, do you foresee that the House, if it does flip to Republican, could see this sort of messaging sort of action just to see what they would do on food stamps, knowing full well it won't pass the Senate. And then come back to some sort of, okay, here we could compromise.
You know, that's a possibility. I mean, before this call, we were spending time internally here looking at how large we think the different caucuses are going to be within the new Republican conference. How many are going to be a part of the Freedom Caucus? How many are going to be a part of Problem Solvers? And so I think it's a possibility that they'll go down the path as a way to try to get the votes. But I don't know with a caucus as small as we think it may be, and we don't know if they're going to have much room to navigate that. I don't know how much many of their middle of the road Republicans are going to go along with that. So to be determined.
So this may be too soon to tell as well, but Alex has submitted a question asking whether there's some of the outcomes of the election make it more possible for folks to come to the middle, to be more pragmatic. I think we all know that both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, we have outliers on policy positions. But given the narrow margins, do we have any lessons that you've seen so far that would suggest that pragmatism might be more popular in compromise?
I'll be real quick if I may. I think that one of the concerns that we've been watching is you know, how loud the voice will be about folks that just are going to say no to anything, right? And if that's a small voice, then I think our hope is that maybe there'll be some pragmatism to allow this thing to move forward. But that's just an initial thought.
Senator Heitkamp.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the narrower, which party is going to benefit from the passage of a farm bill? Ask yourself that. And I would suggest that the Republicans have a much greater interest in getting a farm bill done. If the House, if the Republicans take over the House and they can't pass a farm bill, that's a messaging and talking point for Democratic challengers running in Democratic districts or in Republican districts saying, look, you took over and you couldn't get a farm bill passed. You know, so these are your people. If you can't, you know, address the concerns of your constituents, then maybe it's time for a change. So what I would tell you is I think that a very narrow House majority is going to lead to the House being much more willing to compromise. Now, whether the hardliners are going to say hell no to everything, that's going to stall out a farm bill, which in fact is not a good political outcome for 2024.
Just to follow up on that with both of you, how does the thinking of leadership change? We watched with a very narrow majority. We watched Speaker Pelosi navigate the House with a very 4 or 5 vote margin. She was able to navigate it, even though you really empower a very small number of members, sometimes 1 or 2. To really slow things down. She was still able to get things passed. Is there more of an urgency for that, for a majority with a narrow majority to kind of give the leadership more leeway or not? What how do you think? If you can put yourself in the minds of Kevin McCarthy at this point.
Michael's probably better equipped to put himself in the minds of than I am.
Well, I certainly know that when we were looking at the leadership races and the candidates that we knew to be true coming in the day, the conversation that we're now having is, well, is that still going to be the same list of candidates? I mean, clearly there was some changes that were unexpected on election day. So I don't know that I have a view on that yet. I will say that going into the election, Leader McCarthy was working very hard to have a large enough margin. And as he said, or as the press release said, working to have a governing majority. And so the question becomes, to the earlier point, does he have a governing majority or not? And I think a big part of that will be what the makeup looks of leadership. Are they going to bring some of the folks from the different factions within the caucus into the leadership room to try to achieve that? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that right now.
I think you have to break it out by issues. There's going to be people who are going to say hell no. They are fiscal conservatives. They don't like the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill has been a moderate compromise piece of legislation with Republican support. President Trump took it to a whole new level with direct payments coming out of the trade support. And so the expectation is that you dance with those who got you there. And let me tell you, rural America got the Republicans a lot of political power in this country, whether it's in these House districts or whether it is in the Senate. And so there's going to be a lot of hand wringing, and I don't know individual members enough, but I do know there are people in the Republican caucus who are going to be hell no on any additional spending and ratcheting back on spending. And that's going to present some real challenges. And let's go back to ethanol. Ethanol is, and the sugar program, always two programs that experience tremendous amount of scrutiny and evaluation. You know, is this the chance that the congressional delegation from Oklahoma sees to kill the ethanol program? I don't know, but that's not good for politically for Republicans.
On the subject of funding, one of our questioners wants to know whether or not the IRA funding, which provided millions more for conservation, will be adequate to cover the needs there. And secondarily, the one topic that we always hear farm groups and universities talk about is the need for more research. We know as we're facing all these climate challenges, it would be very helpful to have, you know, better crop spread and more science behind what we're learning from these changing climatic patterns. But it always seems to be the one area that drops down in importance as we get through a farm bill. Do you see a significant amount of money staying in the Farm Bill for conservation from the Inflation Reduction Act? And secondly, research rising any farther to the top in terms of priorities? Senator Heitkamp, let's start with you.
Well, first off, I would tell you that I don't see that there's going to be a lot of big changes to the Inflation Reduction Act. For a state like North Dakota, in spite of the fact that both of our United States senators and our congressmen didn't vote for it, it's that the pieces of this are incredibly popular, whether it's enhanced funding for EQIP, whether it's taking a look at hydrogen hubs in the energy sector. This is a piece of legislation for a state like mine. What's not to like, other than the price tag, right? So I would say that there's been a fair amount of investment there, but let's not forget that the research that's being done by the pilot projects that are being funded by the CCC, that basically Vilsack took a page out of Trump's book, took the CCC funding, and instead of providing direct payments in trade support payments, basically has taken that money and invested it a lot in climate research. I mean, I was just in the state of Tennessee, met with their, at the University of Tennessee, met with their land grant folks, and they are part of a big consortium in the South Central area. They're part of the country taking a look at climate. And so back to Michael's point, if this becomes an area of scrutiny, they're going to do a lot of oversight on CCC spending. That could lead to a ratcheting back of investment that is currently being made in research, especially on climate.
Michael, thoughts?
Yeah, so great questions. You know, a couple of things, and just to set the stage on spending, and I'm not offering this anyway other than it's just kind of the reality of the last 6 years. You know, in the 4 years of the Trump administration, over $7 trillion in new spending. 4 trillion of that was bipartisan and was in the COVID arena. And then in the last 2 years, over $4 trillion in spending. And some of that was also bipartisan when you think about infrastructure. And so there's been kind of a flow of dollars in the last 6 years for a lot of different reasons. We've had a lot of things happen here in the country and around the world. But at the same time, some of the spending that was authorized was on a partisan level. And so if I kind of had to just kind of play this out a little bit when we talk about the conservation funding, with the margins being as close as they are in the House and the Senate, it's going to be a matter of, is it a priority for members in terms of their Farm Bill vote? And if it is a priority to try to maintain that funding and use it in a way that it was meant for, then that'll probably, provide folks some leverage on maintaining that spending going forward. I think on research, it is something that has strong bipartisan support. I mean, historically, everybody says the right things on research. And then when it comes to divvying up the money, other things take priority. But there are a lot of challenging events now. And it seems to I think, a lot of us, just beyond anecdotally, those events have far more significant consequences than what we've had in the past. Not just on climate and what folks are trying to do and put together on climate adaptability, but just on a whole host of other issues that have a real impact on producers' bottom line. So I do think there's going to be a serious focus on research. In terms of funding overall for the bill, the IRA did provide some alternative sources of funding, and how that's all knit together as they put together the Farm Bill is to be determined, but obviously it's going to be one of the top conversations.
Hey, can I just say to Phil, you wisely put the message down about the members who serve on the ag appropriations side. Obviously, we talk a lot about a Farm Bill, but ag appropriations has something to say about all of this. How do you see ag appropriations changing, Phil, as you look at kind of membership?
Well, the membership is not changing that much. Andy Harris is now the ranking member. Can be tough on spending, but as you know, appropriators tend to be on the committee because they tend to be a little more supportive of spending, or they wouldn't get on the committee in the first place. But the whole spending issue is a big question that I have in terms of how hard are some of the conservatives going to push to fight spending? How hard are they going to push on this debt ceiling issue? That's a big unknown. And then, of course, we had the whole issue with SNAP and nutrition assistance, and they pushed hard to try to cut that the last time. And instead, SNAP's spending as a result of the Farm Bill has actually gone up. So,
if I can say something about nutrition, where I see the lines being drawn is on a work requirement. And I think that we're going to see that come out again. I think that there may be some possibilities for compromise on that, given the more conservative nature of some of the members of the Senate. But I think those are going to be kind of the fighting that it's maybe not going to be cutting those programs as much as it is restricting eligibility for the programs, which in essence, because these are mandated, meaning that if somebody applies and they qualify, they get the access. Because it's being mandated, they'll look at eligibility, not the overall appropriations amount.
But Heidi, I think you made a very good point earlier. Just to reiterate, you said that this Farm Bill is more important politically to Republicans than it is to Democrats. That gives the Democrats some leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just got a couple minutes left. One thing on leadership, a question had come in asking about, do we expect that the current leaders, whether they're in the majority or the minority of the House and Senate Ag committees, to stay, especially Senator Stabenow, who chairs the Senate Ag committee, but has opportunities to go to other committees. Will she stay on Ag, Senator Heitkamp?
I think Debbie will stay on Ag, but I haven't talked to her directly, as probably a lot of people know. She's a very good friend of mine. We always say we were the redheaded caucus, along with James Lankford in the United States Senate. One of the reasons why I think Debbie might stay is the commodities portion of this. The Senate Ag Committee has asserted, I think rightfully, jurisdiction over cryptocurrency. It's an emerging area. It's something that is intellectually challenging to somebody like Debbie Stabenow. She also serves and is high ranking on finance, but that's not a committee that she can get, given that Ron Wyant basically had been reelected to the United States Senate. And so what I would say is I expect that Debbie's going to stay. I don't know where Bozeman is in rotation on other areas, but I sure hope he stays. I like John a lot. He was just reelected. I think he is a reasonable guy. I think he's a principled leader. And I think with Debbie and John, I can't speak to the House, but with Debbie and John, agriculture is in good hands if they stay in those jobs.
Well, thank you for that. And I really like to thank all of you once again for participating in this. We have several more questions that unfortunately we aren't able to get to, but thanks for those of you who have offered those up, and we'll take a look and see if we can respond to you in any way. And I'd also like to encourage you to continue to follow our election coverage on Agri-Pulse.com, as well as to participate with us in any future webinars on our Newsmaker show. Will be airing on Friday that also has some election recap of looking at some of the key outcomes in terms of voter representation there. If you missed a portion of the webinar today, please come to our website. We'll send you an email link to it, and you'll be able to get the recording either later today or tomorrow. So stay tuned. We're going to keep covering these issues as well as look at the upcoming Farm Bill. Thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.